It began on a night when the wind simply forgot to blow, and the silence of the Mojave Desert became heavy enough to crush a man's chest. A silence so profound that Samuel, a man who had spent 40 years fixing engines and breaking his own back under the hoods of rusted trucks, wiped the grease from his hands and looked up at the vast, indifferent canopy of stars, feeling a sudden and inexplicable vibration in the marrow of his bones. Before we descend into the depths of this revelation, I need you to pause for a moment and ask yourself a question that might haunt you long after this video ends. Do you believe that your life is merely a biological accident, or do you feel deep in your gut that something is watching, waiting, and perhaps even tending to your soul like a gardener tends to a rare flower? If you believe there is more to this reality than what we can see, type "I am listening" in the comments right now, because what Samuel witnessed that night changes the definition of everything we thought we knew about history and faith. And if you are one of the few who seeks the light hidden behind the shadows, join our community by subscribing, because here we do not just tell stories, we uncover the fragments of a broken truth. Samuel was not a man of church pews or hymnals. He found his gospel in the rhythm of a piston and the honesty of a hard day's work, living alone in a small shack behind his garage miles away from the nearest town, where the only company he kept was the static of an old AM radio and the memories of a wife who had passed on 3 winters ago. He was closing the metal shutter of the workshop when the air inside the room shifted, changing pressure so rapidly that his ears popped and the gentle hum of the fluorescent lights died instantly, plunging him into a darkness that felt alive, a darkness that smelled not of oil and dust but of ozone and something ancient, like the scent of rain on hot stone after a 1,000-year drought. He reached for his flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but before his thumb could graze the switch, a soft, amber light began to emanate from the corner of the garage. Not from a bulb or a fire, but from the skin of a figure standing perfectly still by the workbench. Samuel wanted to run, his instincts screaming at him to flee, to grab the shotgun from behind the counter, but his legs refused to move, anchored by a wave of tranquility that washed over him, a sensation of peace so overwhelming it brought tears to his eyes before he could even understand why. The being was tall, taller than any man Samuel had ever seen, and its skin was not smooth but textured, covered in fine iridescent scales that shimmered like polished copper and emerald in the low light, yet there was nothing monstrous about it, no malice in its posture, only a regal, terrifying grace that made Samuel feel small, like a child standing before a mountain. The creature's eyes were large, vertical slits of liquid gold that seemed to see not just Samuel's face, but the grief etched into his timeline, the loneliness he hid behind his work, and the silent prayers he thought went unheard. It did not speak with a mouth, but Samuel heard the voice echo inside his skull, a voice that sounded like many waters rushing together, resonant and calm, bypassing his ears and vibrating directly against his consciousness. "Do not be afraid, builder of machines," the voice resonated. "I am not here to take, I am here to correct the record." Samuel found his voice, a rasping whisper in the heavy air, asking, Are you a demon? Or are you one of them, the ones they talk about on the radio, the invaders?" The being stepped forward, and the scales on its face shifted slightly, mimicking a human expression of sorrowful amusement. "Invaders is a word for those who break into a house," the being projected. "We are merely the architects checking the foundation. You call us Anunnaki, the ones who came from the sky, and your scholars, your conspirators. They weave tales that we came for your gold, that we enslaved your kind to dig into the dirt for yellow metal to save our dying atmosphere. It is a clever lie, a simple story for simple minds. Because you understand greed, you understand currency, so you projected your own nature onto us." Samuel felt his fear dissolving into a profound curiosity, a thirst for understanding that outweighed the absurdity of the moment. "If you didn't come for the gold," Samuel asked, his hands trembling not from terror but from the sheer intensity of the presence, "then why are you here? Why have you been here for so long?" The being extended a hand, long-fingered and elegant, and pointed a single digit towards Samuel's chest, right where his heart beat a frantic rhythm. "Gold is a conductor of electricity, Samuel. It is useful, yes, but it is cold. It is dead matter. The universe does not run on metal. It runs on consciousness. It runs on the resonant energy of the living soul. We did not come to mine the earth. We came to farm the spirit. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, staggering him back against the workbench. The idea was terrifying, implying that humanity was nothing more than cattle. But the being sensed his revulsion instantly and softened the psychic connection, flooding Samuel with a feeling of immense love, a paternal warmth that felt strikingly similar to the stories Samuel's grandmother used to tell him about the love of Christ. "Do not misunderstand," the voice soothed. "We do not eat souls. That is the fear of the dark speaking. Think of a gardener who grows grapes not to destroy the vine, but to harvest the wine which is the essence of the fruit, raised to a higher form. For eons, we have watched, we have tweaked, we have waited. Your scriptures call it the harvest. Your prophets speak of a separation of wheat and chaff. They speak of a time when the sky will roll back like a scroll and the worthy will be lifted. Did you think that was magic? It is physics. It is the physics of the soul." Samuel looked around his garage at the greasy tools, the calendar on the wall, the mundane reality of his life, and suddenly it all felt like a stage set, a temporary container for something much larger. "So, God," Samuel whispered, the word hanging heavy in the air. "Jesus, the rapture. Are you saying you are them?" The creature's eyes glowed brighter, pulsing with a rhythm that matched Samuel's own heartbeat. "We are the servants of the source. The one you call God is the frequency that gave birth to all, the sound that created the light. The one you call the Christ was the pure signal, the tuning fork sent to calibrate your vibrations, to show you how to ripen your souls so they could survive the extraction from this heavy dimension. He told you, 'My kingdom is not of this world.' He was preparing you for the transition. We are the reapers, Samuel, but we do not reap with scythes. We reap with resonance." Samuel fell to his knees, the weight of the revelation buckling his legs, as the pieces of a lifetime of Sunday school lessons and late-night radio shows clashed and merged into a horrifying, beautiful picture. The Anunnaki, the reptilians, the Watchers, they weren't monsters stealing gold. They were cosmic midwives waiting for the birth. "But why me?" Samuel choked out, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. "I'm just a mechanic. I fix trucks. I'm nobody." The being moved closer, and for the first time Samuel felt a physical touch, a warm, dry hand resting on his shoulder, sending a jolt of pure energy through his nervous system that cleared the fog of his arthritis and the ache in his lower back instantly. "Because, Samuel, you have spent your life fixing things that are broken," the voice echoed, gentle now, almost whispering. "You understand that an engine cannot run if the timing is off. The timing of this world is coming to an end. The cycle is complete. The gold we sought was never in the ground. The gold is the alchemical transformation of a human soul through suffering, love, and faith. You have suffered, Samuel. You have loved. And despite your solitude, you have kept an ember of faith alive. That makes you high-grade ore. That makes you ready." Samuel looked up into the alien face and saw not a lizard, but a reflection of something divine, a creature that had waited thousands of years for this specific moment in time. "Is it happening now?" Samuel asked. "Is this the end?" The creature withdrew its hand and the light in the room began to intensify, shifting from amber to a blinding white. "It is not the end, Samuel. It is the graduation. But first, you must understand the true mechanism of the soul, for there are forces that wish to keep the fruit on the vine until it rots. You have been chosen to bear witness, not to the world, but to yourself. Stand up." Samuel stood, and as he did, the walls of the garage seemed to dissolve, melting away into a vast starry expanse. He was no longer in the Mojave. He was standing on a threshold of light, looking down at the blue marble of Earth, seeing it not as a planet of rock and water, but as a humming, vibrating grid of billions of lights, souls, some dim, some flickering, and some burning with the brilliance of a supernova. "Look," the being commanded, pointing to the grid. "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Do you see the gold now, Samuel? Do you see what we truly came for?" Samuel wept openly, for he saw the beauty of humanity stripped of its flesh, a network of pure potential. And he understood that the gold of the Anunnaki was the refined spirit of a human being who had learned to love in a world of hate. But as the vision faded and the garage walls solidified back into existence, the being's tone shifted, becoming urgent and grave. But there is a reason I have revealed this to you tonight. The frequency is shifting. The separation has begun. And you, Samuel, must make a choice. You can return to your engines and forget this dream, or you can accept the truth that your soul is the currency of the cosmos and help us prepare the others. The silence returned to the desert, but it was no longer heavy. It was pregnant with expectation. Samuel stood alone in the dark, the scent of ozone fading, replaced by the smell of sagebrush and cooling asphalt, but he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that nothing would ever be the same again. The sun rose over the Mojave the following morning, not as a promise of a new day, but as a verdict, casting long, accusing shadows across the concrete floor of the garage where Samuel still stood, rooted to the spot where the fabric of his reality had been torn open and stitched back together with threads of light. And though the alien visitor was gone, the silence it left behind was louder than any engine he had ever revved. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had been stiff with arthritis for a decade, gnarled like old oak roots from years of wrestling with rusted bolts and cold steel. But now they flexed with the fluidity of water, the pain completely erased, a physical testament that the night had not been a hallucination, born of loneliness and diesel fumes. Samuel tried to return to the ritual of his existence. He walked to the percolator to brew his coffee. He turned on the radio to catch the morning farm report, but the static between the stations sounded different now, no longer just random noise, but a rhythmic coded hum, as if the universe itself was breathing against the receiver. He drove his pickup truck into the small town of Jericho Creek later that afternoon, needing to see human faces, needing to anchor himself in the mundane grit of the ordinary world, to keep from floating away into the ether of his own mind. But as he sat in the corner booth of the diner, watching the waitress pour coffee and the local sheriff argue about the price of feed, he realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he had lost the ability to see just the surface of things. Where he once saw lines of worry on the waitress's face, he now saw a dim, flickering luminescence beneath her skin, a bruised purple light pulsing in her chest, the visual frequency of a soul weighed down by unaddressed grief and the heavy lead of despair. And he understood then that the gold the visitor spoke of was not a metaphor for value, but a literal description of the energy emitted by a spirit that had been refined by the fires of life. He looked around the diner and saw a landscape of unmined awe, people walking around carrying galaxies inside their rib cages, completely unaware that they were being watched, tended, and waited upon by forces that spanned the dark gaps between the stars. The conflict within him began to rage like a fever, a war between the Sunday school verses etched into his memory and the cosmic physics he had just been shown, for if the Anunnaki were the harvesters, and if Christ was the tuner of the frequency, then everything he had been told about judgment was wrong. It wasn't a courtroom with a gavel, it was a laboratory with a spectrometer, and the test wasn't about obeying rules, it was about resonance. He drove back to the garage in a daze, the desert sunset bleeding crimson across the horizon, looking less like a sky and more like the interior of a living organ, and he stopped by the side of the road where an old wooden cross marked the spot of a crash from years ago. He got out and touched the wood, closing his eyes, and whispered into the cooling air, "If I am to help, show me how, because I am just a man who fixes trucks. I do not know how to fix a soul." The answer came 3 days later, not from the sky but from the highway. A storm had rolled in, rare and violent, turning the dust into mud and the road into a slick trap, and amidst the howling wind, the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal shattered the night. Samuel ran out into the rain, his flashlight cutting a beam through the deluge, finding a sedan wrapped around a telephone pole, steam rising from the crushed radiator like a dying breath. Inside, a young man was pinned, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with the primal terror of the end. In the old life, Samuel would have panicked. He would have fumbled for a pulse, screamed for an ambulance that was 40 minutes away. But in this new life, time seemed to slow down, expanding into a bubble of hyperclarity. He reached through the shattered window and took the boy's hand, and instantly the connection re-established, that same hum he had felt with the entity. But this time, Samuel was the conduit, not the receiver. He felt the boy's fear as a cold, jagged spike in the energy field, a dissonant frequency that was tearing his spirit away from his body too soon, in a way that would damage the harvest. Samuel didn't pray in words. He didn't beg God for a miracle. Instead, he closed his eyes and remembered the feeling of the alien's hand on his shoulder, that absolute, unwavering frequency of peace, and he projected it, pushing that calm through his own arm and into the dying boy's system. "Look at me," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm, steady as a stone. "You are not breaking. You are shifting. Do not be afraid of the transition." The boy's eyes locked onto Samuel's, and the panic began to recede, replaced by a sudden, confused serenity, the jagged spike in the energy field smoothing out into a coherent wave. Samuel saw it then, the moment the gold was refined, as the boy's fear transmuted into acceptance, the light inside him brightening, shedding the heavy dross of earthly terror and becoming pure, conductive signal. When the boy took his last breath, it wasn't a gasp of defeat but a sigh of release, and Samuel saw with his physical eyes a wisp of golden light detach from the body, hovering for a microsecond before shooting upward, not into the clouds, but through them, answering a magnetic pull that came from somewhere beyond the veil. Samuel stood in the rain, soaked and muddy, watching the spot where the light had vanished, and he knew that the harvest had just taken place, not with a grim reaper's scythe, but with the gentle precision of a gardener plucking a ripe grape. The ambulance arrived, the sheriff asked questions, but Samuel answered in monosyllables, a man apart, for he had seen the machinery of eternity at work. In the weeks that followed, Samuel did not become a preacher. He did not stand on a crate and shout about aliens or the end times, for he realized that words were low-frequency tools, clumsy and inefficient. Instead, he simply lived. He fixed engines, but while he worked, he listened to his customers, really listened, tuning into their frequencies, offering a word of hope here, a gesture of forgiveness there, acting as a tuning fork in the middle of the desert. He noticed that people who came to his shop angry left calm, that those who came grieving left with a strange sense of lightness, not knowing that the old mechanic was quietly helping them shed the lead from their souls, preparing them for the inevitable lift. One evening, months later, as he sat on the porch of his shack, watching the constellations wheel overhead, the presence returned, not as a visible figure this time, but as a thought placed gently into his mind, clear as a bell. "You understand now," the voice resonated within him. "The rapture is not an evacuation, Samuel. It is a resonance. Those who vibrate with the frequency of fear and greed are too heavy to rise. They are anchored to the density of this world. Only those who have transmuted their lead into gold, through love and surrender, can match the frequency of the shift. We are not the saviors. We are the magnet. You are the metal. And the Christ? He was the one who gave you the magnetic charge." Samuel nodded to the empty desert, tears of gratitude streaming down his face, finally understanding the grand design. The earth was a school, a forge, a garden, and the Anunnaki, the angels, the watchers, they were just the farmhands waiting for the season to turn. He looked up at the stars, no longer seeing cold, distant fusion reactors, but seeing the lights of a billion other souls, a cosmic city waiting for the new arrivals. He took a sip of his coffee, the steam rising into the cool night air, and for the first time in his life he didn't feel small, he didn't feel alone, he felt ready. Perhaps the sky never really ends, Samuel thought, the words drifting into the silence. Perhaps the darkness is just the soil in which we are planted, and death is simply the moment we break the surface and see the sun for the first time. Truth or fiction? Maybe the answer doesn't lie in the evidence we can touch, but in the shiver you feel when you look up at the night sky and realize that something, somewhere, is looking back. The magician only reveals himself to those who are willing to believe that the trick is real and that the magic was inside the observer all along. The seasons turned over the Mojave like pages in a dusty Bible, the scorching heat of summer giving way to the biting winds of autumn, And with each passing month, the change in Samuel became more pronounced, not in his appearance, which remained that of a weathered mechanic in oil-stained denim, but in the gravitational pull of his presence, a quiet intensity that began to draw people from towns far beyond Jericho Creek. They came with overheating radiators and blown gaskets, but they stayed for something they couldn't name. Sitting on the wooden benches in his workshop while he worked, drinking his bad coffee and feeling the knot of anxiety in their chests loosen, untie, and dissolve into the heavy desert air. Samuel worked on the machines, but his true labor was invisible. He had become a master of the frequency, sensing the discordant vibrations of bitterness, of regret, of fear that clung to his customers like rust, and with a simple touch on a shoulder or a look that seemed to bypass the retina and speak to the soul, he helped them tune their instruments. But as his capacity for the light grew, so did the shadows. For the universe seeks balance, and a light that bright inevitably attracts the moths of a darker variety, forcing Samuel to confront the final lesson the visitor had hinted at, the resistance. It began with the dreams, not the peaceful visions of the golden grid, but chaotic, jagged nightmares of static and noise, a feeling of immense pressure pressing down on the roof of his house, a sensation of being watched by eyes that were cold and devoid of the golden warmth of the Anunnaki. One Tuesday, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the lot, kicking up a cloud of dust that refused to settle, and out stepped three men in suits that looked too clean for the desert, their energy fields feeling like black holes, sucking the light out of the afternoon sun. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't ask for a repair. They simply stood by the pumps, radiating a silent, oppressive menace, a frequency of control and suppression that made the hairs on Samuel's arms stand up, not in fear, but in recognition. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked out to meet them, his heart beating a steady, rhythmic drum against the intrusion, realizing instantly that these were the agents of the lead, the forces committed to keeping humanity heavy, asleep, and anchored to the material plane. "You're drawing attention, Samuel," the lead man said, his voice flat and metallic, lacking any musicality. "People are talking about miracles, about healings. We don't like anomalies. Anomalies disturb the status quo." Samuel looked at the man and saw the tragedy beneath the threat. He saw a soul encased in layers of concrete, terrified of its own liberation, dedicated to the maintenance of a prison it didn't even know it was in. "I am just a mechanic," Samuel replied, his voice vibrating with that strange multi-layered resonance he had acquired. "I fix what is broken." "If the world is broken, is it a crime to try and fix it?" The man stepped closer, invading Samuel's personal space, and for a moment the psychic pressure was immense, a headache blooming behind Samuel's eyes as the man projected a wave of pure intimidation. "Stop the signal, Samuel. Go back to being nobody, or we will shut down the transmitter permanently." They left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving a trail of exhaust and bad intentions. But the encounter did not frighten Samuel. Instead, it clarified his purpose, proving that the harvest was near, for the weeds always fight hardest, just before the reaper comes. He understood then that the separation of the wheat and the chaff wasn't just a metaphor for the afterlife. It was happening right now, in the choices men made between fear and love, between control and surrender. That night, Samuel drove his truck deep into the canyons, far away from the interference of the black SUV and the hum of the town, climbing to a plateau where the sky felt low enough to touch. He built a fire, the crackle of the mesquite wood the only sound in the vast emptiness, and he sat in meditation, calling out not with words but with his frequency, sending a pulse of readiness into the cosmos. "I am here," he projected. "I am holding the line, but I need to know. How does it end?" The answer came not as a voice but as a vision that overtook him completely, pulling his consciousness out of his body and suspending him in orbit above the Earth once more. He saw the planet not as it was, but as it was becoming. He saw the grid of lights he had witnessed before, but now the connections were intensifying, geometric patterns of gold forming across continents, linking the awakened souls into a massive, protective shield. He saw that the rapture wasn't people floating into the sky, leaving their clothes behind. It was a phase shift, a sudden, collective jump in vibration where the earth itself seemed to split into two overlapping realities. In one reality, the old world of conflict, greed, and the men in black suits continued to crumble, consuming itself in its own density, a realm of shadows fighting shadows. In the other, overlaying it like a double exposure, was a world of luminosity, where the gold souls existed in a state of heightened perception, walking the same earth, but interacting with a higher dimension of it, untouched by the decay of the old. The Anunnaki visitor appeared beside him in this vision, its presence massive and comforting. "There is no escape, Samuel," the entity communicated. "There is only ascension. You do not leave the earth to go to heaven. You bring heaven down by becoming compatible with its frequency. The kingdom is here. It is just on a channel most have not dialed into yet. The men who came to you today, they are trapped on the lower dial. They cannot see you where you are going. To them, you will simply disappear, not because you have moved, but because you have ceased to exist in their spectrum of perception." The vision faded, depositing Samuel back onto the cold rocks of the plateau. The fire reduced to embers, the eastern horizon beginning to grey with the approach of dawn. He felt exhausted, his physical body heavy, but his spirit was light, buoyant, vibrating with a joy that felt like helium in his blood. He drove back down the mountain, knowing that his time as a simple mechanic was drawing to a close, not because he would die, but because he was becoming something else, something the old world could no longer contain. The final transformation happened on a Sunday, appropriately enough, when the garage was closed and the air was still. Samuel was sitting on his porch, reading the old leather-bound Bible his mother had given him, reading the words of Revelation, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth," when he felt the click, the final tumbler in the lock of his DNA falling into place. It started as a hum in his ears, then a heat in his chest, spreading outward to his limbs, turning his blood into liquid light. He looked at his hands and saw them becoming translucent, the solid matter of bone and flesh giving way to the energetic blueprint beneath. He didn't panic. He smiled. He stood up and walked off the porch, his feet barely touching the dust, and as he walked, the landscape around him began to shimmer, the rusty hues of the desert brightening into colors that had no names, the scrub brush glowing with internal fire. He saw the Anunnaki ship then, not descending from the clouds but manifesting out of the air right in front of him, a massive structure of crystalline light and sound, vibrating in perfect harmony with his own soul. It wasn't a spaceship, it was a cathedral of frequency. The ramp didn't lower, the field simply expanded to include him. As he stepped forward, merging with the light, he looked back one last time at his old shack, at the shell of his former life, and he felt a wave of infinite compassion for the world he was graduating from. He realized that Jesus, the Anunnaki, the angels, they were all waiting not as judges but as family welcoming a traveler home from a long, perilous journey through the dark. Samuel didn't disappear in a flash. He simply stepped sideways into the light, shifting his frequency from AM to FM, leaving the static behind forever. In Jericho Creek, the sheriff found the garage unlocked the next day. The coffee pot was still warm. The radio was playing a hymn. But Samuel was gone. The official report said, "Missing person," but the people he had touched, the ones whose engines he had fixed and whose souls he had tuned, they knew better. They felt a strange warmth whenever they passed the old garage, a lingering resonance of peace that never quite faded. They knew that Samuel hadn't gone missing. They knew, in the quiet places of their own hearts, that the harvest had come and the gold had finally been collected. And as you sit there listening to this voice, feeling the vibration of these words, ask yourself, is the heaviness in your chest the weight of the world, or is it the lead waiting to be transmuted? The signal is broadcasting right now. The tuning fork is striking the note. Can you hear it, or are you still just listening to the noise? The disappearance of Samuel Vance was marked in the county records as an unsolved missing person case, a file gathering dust in a metal cabinet under the flickering lights of the sheriff's station. But for Sheriff Elias Miller, the man who had known Samuel since they were boys playing stickball in the dust of the Depression, the file was not closed. It was burning a hole in his conscience. Miller was a man of evidence, a man who trusted fingerprints, tire tracks, and blood samples. But in the weeks following Samuel's vanishing, He found himself driving out to the abandoned garage every night, parking his cruiser by the rusted fence, and simply sitting in the dark, waiting for a logic that would explain why the air around the shack still hummed with an electrical charge that made his teeth ache. He had been the first one on the scene, the one who found the coffee pot still warm, and he was the one who found the logbook lying open on the workbench, a standard mechanic's ledger that should have contained invoices and part numbers, but instead contained a map of the human condition that terrified him. He remembered picking it up that first morning, his hands shaking, reading the entries written in Samuel's jagged handwriting. Sarah Jenkins, 04 Corolla, alternator replacement, soul frequency low, weighted by resentment of father, tuning required, followed by a later entry. Alternator fixed, resentment grounded, frequency rising. She is ready for the shift. Miller had hidden the book in his jacket before the state police arrived, sensing with a primal instinct that this was dangerous knowledge, the kind of evidence that gets buried along with the man who wrote it. On the fourth night of his vigil, the silence of the desert was shattered once again by the hum of an engine, but it wasn't a spacecraft. It was the same black SUV Samuel had encountered, the vehicle of the sweepers, the agents of the lead. Miller watched from his cruiser as three figures emerged, silhouetted against the moonlight, moving toward the garage with the precision of a demolition crew, carrying canisters that smelled of accelerant. They weren't there to investigate. They were there to sanitize, to burn the infection of hope out of the landscape before it could spread to the rest of the herd. Miller stepped out of his car, his hand resting on the grip of his service revolver, not because he thought bullets would work, but because it was the only talisman of authority he had. "Property is seized," he called out, his voice cracking slightly before finding its iron. "This is an active crime scene. You boys are trespassing." The leader of the trio turned, his face a blur of shadow in the darkness, and Miller felt that same wave of psychic pressure Samuel had described, a crushing weight of despair and futility that made him want to kneel in the dirt and put his gun in his own mouth. "There is no crime here, Sheriff," the figure said, the voice sounding like grinding stones. "There is only a glitch. We are here to patch the glitch. Go home to your wife, Elias. Forget you ever saw the light in this place. It is a false signal." Miller's knees buckled under the assault of the negative frequency, the despair washing over him like a black tide, telling him that nothing mattered, that humanity was just cattle, that the harvest was a lie. But as he fell, his hand brushed against the pocket of his uniform where he kept Samuel's logbook, and the moment his fingers touched the leather cover, a spark jumped. It wasn't a spark of electricity, it was a spark of memory. He remembered the look on the face of the boy Samuel had saved on the highway. He remembered the peace in the eyes of the waitress at the diner, and he realized that the ledger wasn't just paper. It was a battery. It was charged with the residue of Samuel's work. Miller gasped, drawing breath into lungs that felt frozen, and he pulled the book out, holding it up like a shield. "You can burn the wood," Miller shouted, his voice rising into a roar that echoed off the canyon walls. "You can burn the roof and the walls, but you cannot burn the resonance. I felt it. I feel it right now." The moment he declared his belief, the garage behind him erupted, not in fire, but in a pulse of that same amber light Samuel had first seen. The structure itself had become a capacitor, storing the excess energy of the ascension, and Miller's act of faith had triggered the release. The light washed over the men in black, and for the first time Miller saw fear in their posture. Not physical fear, but the existential terror of shadows exposed to a supernova. They shielded their eyes, stumbling back, their dark auras hissing and evaporating in the brilliance of the high-frequency wave. They scrambled back into their vehicle, the engine roaring as they fled, unable to exist in a space that had become so thoroughly consecrated by truth. Miller stood alone as the light faded back into a gentle, steady glow, realized that he had just been deputized into a war he didn't understand, but one he was now willing to fight. He didn't reopen the garage, he didn't try to fix cars, but he kept the logbook. And in the years that followed, when the townspeople of Jericho Creek felt the weight of the world pressing down on them, when the lead in their souls became too heavy to bear, they would find the sheriff sitting on his porch, and he would tell them a story about a mechanic who fixed engines and farmed souls. He would read them a page from the book, and they would leave his porch feeling lighter, feeling tuned, feeling ready. The garage eventually fell to ruin, reclaimed by the sand and the wind, but the frequency didn't fade. It spread. It jumped from Jericho Creek to the next town, and the next, a silent, invisible network of gold forming beneath the surface of the mundane world. And so, the Anunnaki plan continued, not through spaceships or grand invasions, but through the quiet, contagious resilience of the human spirit. The visitor was right. They didn't come for the metal in the ground. They came for the alloy forged in the fire of our resistance. And now the question turns to you, the witness of this story. Do you feel the resonance? Are you part of the harvest? Or are you just waiting for the rain? The signal is strong tonight. All you have to do is tune in.